I'm sorry that I wasn't able to do the parsha last week. So we'll try to get in two parshiot this week. In fact, last week's parsha and this week's parsha are really one unit, in that both of them have to do with the experience of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. And the fact that we split it up into two separate parshiot is because there are two different dimensions to what happened at Mount Sinai, and that's what I'd like to look at today. Simon will be posting at a certain point a source sheet for this class, but I'm not going according to my source sheet. My source sheet essentially is for people who want to look at certain things that I referenced to be able to actually have it in front of you. So without any further ado, let me begin by actually going back to something that we saw in chapter 6, okay, which at the time I referred to as the speech of redemption. So if you look at chapter 6, verse 7, we discussed that there are 4 stages of redemption in the process of going from slavery to freedom. And corresponding to those 4 stages, at least according to one opinion in the Talmud, we have 4 cups of wine that we drink at the Seder. And what I'm interested in looking at is stage number 4. So this is chapter 6, verse 7, and we've seen this before, where it says, "V'lakachti etchem li la'am," I will take you to me to be a people, "V'hayiti lachem le'Elohim," and I will be to you a God. And at the time, I quoted one of the medieval commentaries, the Sforno, who said that this is referring to Mount Sinai. And in effect, what we're talking about in terms of Mount Sinai is what we could call the covenantal relationship which was established between God and the Jewish people. That is actually what happens in our parsha, in chapter 24, and that's what we're going to be looking at in a few moments. But before we look at the covenantal relationship, I want to actually look at the beginning of the process, which is last week's parsha, which is chapter 19. So we're told of how the Jewish people come to the Sinai desert, how they encamp opposite the mountain. And now let's look at chapter 19, verse 3. Moshe Allah Elohim, and Moshe went up to God, and God called out to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus should you say to the house of Jacob, and tell to the Jewish people, you saw," verse 4, "that which I did to Egypt. I carried you on the wings of eagles," although for accuracy, it's actually a griffin vulture, but I won't get into that. "And I brought you to me." And now we get to verse 5. Ve'ata, and now, "Im shamoa tishma'u b'koli," if you will hearken to my voice, "ushmartem et briti," and observe, guard my covenant, "V'item li segula mikol ha'amim," and you will be a treasure to me from all the nations. When I would teach this in Pardes, I would say that the word skula means my precious. Kili kol haaretz, because the land is mine. And then verse 6, which is really critical for us, "V'atem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh," and you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. hadvarim asher tedaber al bnei Israel. These are the words that you should speak to the Jewish people. Now, at the very beginning, God tells Moshe that what he is interested in is in creating a covenant with the Jewish people. And we might even say that the mission statement of this covenant is Vatem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim, you will be a kingdom of priests. Okay, v'goy kadosh, in a holy nation. Okay, first of all, you should realize that on a certain level, the terminology kingdom of priests is a kind of the oxymoron. And what do I mean by that? Because the whole idea of a kingdom, of sovereignty, of majesty, okay, seems to be at odds with also the idea of being a priest, because the whole essence of being a priest is one of service. But I think for those of you who've actually been following my podcasts or even these live with Rav Meir episodes, so to speak, one of the major themes that I see throughout the Torah, which is something which Rabbi Soloveitchik articulated, okay, very clearly as an interpretation of the two creation stories, is the sense of majesty and humility. And this is, in a certain sense, the image of what one might say is the role of what it means to be a human being, to have majesty and humility. And that concept is now being extended to the Jewish people in terms of, on the one hand, being a mamlacha, of being a kingdom, a sovereign nation that has majesty, but also being kohanim, those who serve. And therefore, what I want to also bring up in this context is that what we find here is something which you can also see throughout the Torah, which is that whenever we talk about Jewish particularism, we always preface it, or if not preface, certainly complement it with the idea of universalism, which means that the fact that God is now entering into a unique relationship with the Jewish people is not to the exclusion of humanity, of the world at large, but on the contrary, is meant to be in service of the world at large. Which means that we have to see our roles as being kohanim, those who are there to serve, those who are there in the same way that the priests in the temple are serving God, are in a certain sense the interface between the Jewish people and God. To a certain extent, the Jewish people become the kohanim of the world. And in a sense, the goal of the Jewish people is to bring the world into relationship with God. So that on the one hand, there is this universal dimension. But on the other hand, there's also the idea of being goy kadosh, a holy people. The first thing which I would like to point out, especially because of how it's evolved over the years, is that the word goy, which very often is seen as a kind of pejorative term, is actually not at all a pejorative term. The word goy essentially means a nation. And what I would even say is that it means a nation with a very clearly defined identity. In fact, in the Haggadah, we even speak about the fact that the Jewish people, when they were in Egypt, this is based on a verse from Deuteronomy, Vayihi sham legoy gadol, we became a big goy. And there's a drash in the Haggadah which says, Shahayu mitsuyanim sham, we excelled there. And the manifestation of our being a goy, of being a nation, and I would even say a unique nation, is in our goy kadosh, being holy. Holy in the sense of being separate, holy in the sense of being transcendent, and as we will discuss in a little while, holy in the sense of being given a whole series of laws, a whole code of behavior, which is unique to who we are as Jews. And I think this becomes extremely important, and I don't want to get carried away with this in terms, certainly not in polemics, but in other words, but from a Jewish perspective, we don't believe that everyone has to become Jewish. There are many, many people out there in the world who are not Jewish, and many, many people out there in the world who, as non-Jews, can have a relationship with God. And since I missed last week, so I'll just mention, I think in last week's Parsha, perhaps the quintessential model for this is Jethro, who is the model of a righteous, pious, non-Jew, who shows that one could be not Jewish and nevertheless still have a relationship, a very profound relationship with God. So that in terms of us as the Jewish people, what makes us separate, what makes us different, is not the fact that we have a relationship with God, but we have a very particular relationship with God. And it's a relationship with God which is expressed in the covenant, which is our Parsha, the covenant which has to do with a very specific set of rules and regulations. Now, this is what's being outlined at the very outset. And this is, in fact, the goal of Mount Sinai, for the Jewish people to enter into a covenantal relationship. And what's kind of ironic a little bit is that very often when people think of Mount Sinai, they think of last week's Parsha, and they think of the revelation at Sinai, and so much emphasis is placed on the revelation and the Ten Commandments, when in fact, the ultimate purpose of Sinai is actually this week's Parsha, which is the covenantal relationship. I would like to just take a few more moments speaking about last week's Parsha in order to be able to just put in perspective why it is that we have this separation between last week's Parsha and our Parsha, and how they focus on two very, very different elements. So let's just look a little bit further in last week's Parsha, in chapter 19. After God outlines what is to be accomplished here at Sinai, Moshe goes to the people and tells them all the words of God. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Moshe tells the people all the words of God, and if you look at chapter 19, verse 8, the response of the people, and it emphasizes, Vayanu chol ha'am yachtav, together. And this is a major theme throughout Mount Sinai, the sense of unity of the Jewish people, the sense of unity of purpose. And they say, whatever God said, we will do, which means that the people commit themselves to entering into this relationship. And then look at verse 9. God says to Moshe, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud. so that the people will hear me speaking to you, and in you they will believe forever. And here I think it's important to note that in fact, the way God is presenting this, the revelation at Sinai was meant to be something radically different than what it ended up being. And that is what God is saying here is God will have a conversation with Moshe. The people will be spectators to that conversation. They will overhear it. And when they hear this conversation between God and Moshe, okay, this will in effect give the people faith in Moshe forever. And for those of you who were with me 2 weeks ago, we spoke about the splitting of the Red Sea, and we mentioned that this is the first time where it says, and the people believed in God and in Moshe, his servant. And what God is now saying is what's about to happen is going to one up what happened at the Red Sea. Not only will the people believe that God is Moshe's servant, but they will believe in Moshe forever. And that's the way it was supposed to be. But all of a sudden, things change. And it's not actually explicitly mentioned in the text. For those of you who would like, you can look at the Rashi on verse 9. So I'll just paraphrase it. Rashi says that when Moshe came and told the people, this is what's about to happen, the people essentially said, but we would like to have God directly speak to us. We would like to have this direct I-thou encounter. And then when the people requested that, this is what Moshe then brings back to God, and that's the end of verse 8. I'm sorry, this is the end of verse 8. I'm sorry, the end of verse 9, yes. And then what God says, well, if the people want to have a direct I-thou encounter, then the people have to prepare themselves. And this is what you find in verse 10, where God says to Moshe, go to the people, the kidashta hayom, sanctify them. But sanctify here also means separate them, prepare them. The people need 3 days to prepare for this experience of God. And because I want to spend a lot of time speaking about our parsha and not get caught up too much with last week's parsha, so I'll just summarize. The people immerse themselves. The men and the women separate, no sexual relations. And the people are now poised, waiting for this I-thou encounter. And then what happens? So let's now look at, fast forward, verse 16. Vayhi bayom hashlishi, and it was on the third day, biyot haboker, in the morning. Vayhi kolot uvrakim, and there are sounds, and there's lightning. Va'anan kaved al har, and a heavy cloud on the mountain. The kol shofar chazak ma'od, and a very powerful sound of the shofar. Vayecharat kol ha'am asher b'machaneh, and everybody in the camp became ultra-Orthodox. Or, for those of you who didn't get the joke, okay, the term in Hebrew for ultra-Orthodox is charedi. Vayecherad means to tremble. The whole people are now trembling, okay? Which means that the experience of, and this is in a certain sense, not even God coming down on the mountain. This is in a certain sense, the prelude is that the people are now trembling. And then what happens subsequently? What we're told is Moshe then needs to take the people out to God. And verse 18, and Mount Sinai is now smoking because God came down in fire. and the fire is going up like the fire of a furnace, and the whole mountain is trembling. And then there's the sound of the shofar, which is getting stronger and stronger. Okay, now I'm going to end at this point, at least for here, and say that the whole essence of this section, and that's last week's parsha, the whole point of last week's parsha was the experience of God which the Jewish people had. And it was a terrifying experience. The people are trembling. The imagery, the sounds that are just getting stronger and stronger, even before God actually speaks. And not only that, but the cloud, the smoke, the fire. By the way, think of the imagery, right? I mean, I'm just trying to take an analogy. It's as if you have now a kind of volcano which is about to erupt, right? Even this image of the mountain trembling. Now, let me throw in one other thing into the hopper, right? Think of it also as something, as a kind of parallel, you might even say test of the Jewish people with what happened at the splitting of the sea. In the splitting of the sea, the Jewish people are told to go into the midst of the water. And as we discussed a little bit, right, it's not as if the water just disappeared. They have a wall of water on the one side, a wall on the other side. They have water on top. And they keep on traveling through this path, right? They can't really deviate to the right or the left. They're traveling the whole night, right? Throughout, there's the possibility that the water will come in and overwhelm them, flood them, so that there's this fear, or this potential fear, of death by water. And now all of a sudden they have a potential fear of death by fire, where there's fire, there's smoke, where at any moment the mountain is trembling. It may be the whole mountain will explode, will implode. Terrifying. And I'm just going to now refer to post 10 Commandments. If you look at chapter 20, verse 14, it says, V'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'kolot ve'et ha'lapidim. And everybody saw the sounds, which everybody realizes is clearly a mixed sensorial experience. Ve'et ha'lapidim, in the torches. Ve'et kol ha'shofar, in the sound of the shofar. Ve'et ha'har ha'shen, in the mount smoking. Vayar ha'am, and the people see and they move. Vayamdu merachok, and they stand at a distance. Vayomru el Moshe, and they say to Moshe, Daber ata imanu v'nishma, you speak to us and we will hear. Al yedaber imanu Elohim, let God not speak to us. Pen namut, lest we die. Vayomer Moshe ha'am, and Moshe says to the people, Al tira'u, don't be afraid. Because God came to test you. And for the purpose that his fear should be on your faces, so that you don't sin. The people stand at a distance, and Moshe went near the thick cloud, the fog, Asher Sham Elohim, where God is. By the way, I just want to point out, and I'll refer to this a little bit later, the Abarbanel, right? And there are a number of different things that are very unclear at what happened at Sinai. And one of the things which maybe people took as being very clear, but maybe is not so clear, is where was Moshe at the time of the revelation? Now, I would venture to say that most people will say, based on what it said earlier in this section, which I didn't read, that Moshe is supposed to go to the top of the mountain. Everybody else is supposed to stay down below. and they're supposed to fence off the mountain, okay, so nobody will go up. And I would assume, by and large, everybody assumes, yes, at the time of the revelation, Moshe was at the top, everybody is down below. But now we have a little bit of a problem, but it seems that people are speaking to Moshe, well, was he on top? And how are they exactly communicating to him? So I'll just mention, it's interesting that one of the classic medieval commentaries who I've mentioned, the Abarbanel, says that actually at the time of the revelation, Moshe was down below with everybody. And he only goes up to the top after the revelation, after the 10 commandments. And he goes to the top after the 10 commandments in order to be able to receive from God a whole series of other laws, which we'll discuss in a few moments. And he bases himself on the fact that because the people are talking to Moshe. But what I want to say as a summary of last week's Parsha is last week's Parsha focuses on the I-thou encounter between the Jewish people and God. An encounter that in a certain sense the Jewish people brought upon themselves, that they requested because they wanted to have that direct experience of God. And God said, if that's what you want, that's what you'll get. And the purpose of that experience, as Moshe says, was so that the fear of God should be embedded on the face of the Jewish people, so that that will be something embedded in their psyche, so that they will not sin subsequently. So that last week, the whole thrust was the Sinai experience. The whole thrust was the 10 commandments, what we might call these lofty central principles of Judaism. By the way, as I mentioned earlier, there is a concept of 7 laws of Noah, which is what is seen as being the code of behavior of non-Jews. So that if you think about it, when the Jewish people receive the 10 commandments, it's like going a little bit further than the 7 laws of Noah. But the thrust was not necessarily the giving of the law as much as the experience of the all-powerful nature of God. An experience that was literally for the Jewish people, the sense that at any moment they may die, which perhaps also gave them a sense of, and I'm using this not in the kitschy way, right, but in the what should be the way it's taken, the awesomeness of God, the magnitude of God. That was last week's Parsha. So now I would like to get to this week's Parsha. And this week's Parsha, in particular in chapter 24, the end of the Parsha, which in my mind is the whole purpose of Sinai. So let's begin chapter 24, verse 1. Ve'el Moshe Amar, and God said to Moshe, Alei el Hashem, go up to God. Ata va'Aharon, you and Aaron, Nadav v'Avihu, okay, 2 of Aaron's sons, V'shiv'im miziknei Israel, 70 of the elders of Israel, V'ishtachavitem merachok, and you will bow at a distance. V'nigash Moshe levado el Hashem, and Moshe went alone to Hashem. Vehem lo yigashu, but they didn't come near. The ha'am and the people lo ya'alu imo. The people didn't go up with him. Now, there is a very interesting disagreement among the commentaries, and this goes back already to the time of the Mishnah, which means we're talking about 2,000 years. When did chapter 24 happen? And maybe I should put it in the following terms. Is chapter 24 in chronological sequence, which means that chapter 24 is happening after the revelation at Sinai, after the Ten Commandments, after everything else that appears in the beginning of our chapter? Or is chapter 24 actually out of chronological sequence? And in fact, when it says that God said to Moshe, go up to the mountain, this is referring to back to what we had in chapter 19, when God, in effect, was telling Moses about going up the mountain before the revelation at Sinai. And without going into, all the different people who say what, let's just suffice it to say, this is a major disagreement between Rashi and Ramban, Nachmanides, and for those people who will, if you want to look at my sheet, Abarbanel says, this was actually a major difference between what we would call the French/German commentaries, medieval commentaries on the Torah, versus the Spanish commentaries, the Sephardic commentaries, which means Rashi says everything which we're speaking about in the section happened before the revelation at Sinai. And I'll just say it to make it clear, which means, as we're about to look and see in more detail, the covenant which the Jewish people enter in this section actually happened before God spoke to them and said the Ten Commandments. Whereas Nachmanides is of the opinion that no, first there was the revelation, first there were the Ten Commandments, and our section is post-Ten Commandments. And if I just also give you some sort of timeline, okay, which I didn't do before, the Jewish people come to Mount Sinai on the first day of the month of Sivan. It seems to be, and for those people, there are always ringers in the crowd, so don't, start getting into nuances over here. But let's take what is the simple pshat and the generally accepted assumption. The revelation at Sinai happened on the 6th day of the month of Sivan. And according to Nachmanides and the school of thought that says things are happening in chronological sequence, the revelation 10 commandments was on day number 6, and our parsha is happening on day number 7, 6-7. And chapter 24 in particular is happening on day number 7. Whereas Rashi is of the opinion that our section actually happened 2 days earlier, day number 5. Now, I'm not going to get into what is it that motivates Rashi and that whole school of thought in saying that things are out of chronological order. Suffice it to say, it may have to do with the fact of this idea of Moshe going up the mountain, which we find in chapter 19, and therefore saying that, in other words, it's not as if there are two goings up to the mountain, there's only one. And Rashi and various other commentaries do not necessarily have a problem of seeing things out of chronological sequence. Clearly, there's always the question, but why would the Torah do that? And I would say that probably the simple explanation would be what I'm going to say to you also with Nachmanides, because the Torah wanted to create a separation between these two different aspects of Mount Sinai, which is the revelation and the covenant. And so therefore we separated them. I will tell you my bias. Generally, I am a big Nachmanides fan when it comes to this particular, I mean, in general, but in terms of this particular point, which is as much as possible, I would like to think the Torah is in chronological sequence. And what I would like to also show you with the time that's remaining is why I think even conceptually, it's extremely important to see that things are in chronological sequence. So working with that assumption for the moment, that things actually are in chronological sequence, according to the position of Nachmanides. So this is how I would like to now look at chapter 24. So let's look at what actually happens. And in fact, we might even say that when it says over here that Moshe comes near, but the rest of the people stay at a distance, this is picking up on the verse that I showed you earlier, which is chapter 20, verse 17. Namely, that after the revelation at Sinai, and after the people said, we don't want to hear God anymore, you go and speak to God, that we find that the people stand at a distance and then Moshe goes into the cloud. And that's essentially what we have by us in chapter 24, verse 2. So that we're picking up from where we left off in chapter 20. And so now let's look at verse 3. Moshe comes near to God, and it says in verse 3, Vayavo Moshe, but then Moshe comes, Vayisaper la'am et kol divrei Hashem, ve'et kol hamishpatim, vayan kol ha'am kol echad vayomeru, kol hadvarim asher diber Hashem na'aseh. Okay, now, this is perhaps one of the reasons which I think supports the Ramban, namely that when Moshe comes to the people and now tells them all the words of God and all the Mishpatim, what are these Mishpatim? So what Nachmanides says is, all the words of God is referring to the end of chapter 20. All of the Mishpatim is referring to essentially the opening chapters of our Parsha. Our Parsha, where it says, Ve'ele HaMishpatim. And what Nachmanides says is that after the 10 Commandments, Moshe goes up the mountain and God then gives him everything from the end of chapter 20 until the end of chapter 23. Moshe then tells that to the people, and the people essentially say in one voice, whatever God says, na'aseh. Now, again, just to be fair to the school of Rashi, He'll say, well, but this idea of the people speaking in one voice and the people saying naaseh, that's exactly what we saw in chapter 19. And so therefore what Rashi will say is, so we're essentially referring back to that section. But what Nachmanides says, and what I would like to say as well, is that the people can speak in one voice a number of times. It doesn't have to be just at one particular point. And so, yes, earlier the people spoke in one voice and said, whatever God said we will do with respect to the idea of being Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. And now the people are speaking in one voice with respect to all of the laws which God gave them in our Parsha. And now let's look at verse 4. After the people essentially, quote unquote, commit themselves, Vayichtov Moshe et kol divrei Hashem, Moshe writes down all the words of God. Vayashkem baboker, he gets up early in the morning, and here Nachmanides says everything which happened, right, from the revelation at Sinai through chapter 24, all happened on day 6. On the sixth day of the month of Sivan. Now Moshe is getting up early in the morning on the 7th of Sivan. I have to say, day number 6 was a pretty full day. Certainly from the perspective of the Jewish people, certainly even more so from Moshe. He had a very, very intense day. And what do the people do? Vayiven Moshe vayiven mizbech tachat har. He builds an altar at the foot of the mountain. Ushtem esrei matzeva, and 12 matzeva monuments, which are also kind of altars. L'shnei masar shivtei Yisrael, for all the 12 tribes. Now, by the way, this is also very, very interesting, because we have one altar, but then we have 12 matzevot. What's the significance of this? So I would like to present right now that the 12 matzevot are in effect altars which are showing the uniqueness of each of the 12 tribes, which each of them will bring offerings upon. What's the Mizbeach? The Mizbeach is one altar. Okay, by the way, according to quite a few commentaries, the difference between a Mizbeach and a Matzeva is a Matzeva is a huge slab of stone, one big stone. A Matzeva is essentially a conglomerate of many stones. Each of the tribes has a matzeva, but in addition to that, there's a mizbeach. And I think that the message over here is, on the one hand, showing the uniqueness and the significance of each tribe as an independent entity, and that's the matzeva. The mizbeach is what brings all the tribes together as one people. So that, again, you have a very interesting concept here of what we would call unity in the context of diversity, so that we acknowledge the diversity of each of the tribes, and yet at the same time, we also have one mizbeach, which is going to be what brings them all together. But we have both. And now look at what we say, what happens. Verse 5. Vayishlach et narei b'nei Israel, and he sends the lads of the Jewish people. Vayalu olot, they bring up burnt offerings. Vayizbechu zvachim, they bring shlamim, peace offerings. Lashem parim, to God. By the way, where are these offerings being brought? Right, we're slaughtering these animals. Okay, it seems to be that each of the tribes is doing it on their matzeva. And they're bringing two types of offerings, olot, burnt offerings, and peace offerings. I'll just say this very briefly now. When we get to Leviticus, we may discuss this much more. The significance of a burnt offering, and maybe at least a major precedent for it, is this idea of expressing one's total commitment to God. Okay, it is something which is completely burnt on an altar, right? And as I said, the precedent, or a major precedent for this, is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where Abraham expresses his total commitment to God. The idea of a zvachim shlamim is a festive offering which is brought by the people, which is actually meant to be for the purpose of community building around eating, community building around rejoicing. So that if I take the combination of the two, it's that I'm bringing offerings that somehow reflect a sense of total commitment to God, and at the same time, a sense of unity of the people, a sense of brotherhood, a sense of togetherness, but togetherness, not just togetherness in joy, in celebration. And then what do we have? Verse 6. Vayikach Moshe chatzi adam vayasem ba'aganot. And Moshe takes half of the blood and places it in basins. V'chatzi adam zarak al hamizbeach. And half of the blood he sprinkles on the altar. Okay, now this blood presumably is from the animals which were sacrificed. And we know as part of the sacrificial service, you sprinkle the blood on the altar. And that's what Moshe does over here, except he only does it with half of the blood. And then what we're told in verse 7, Vayikach Sefer Habrit, he takes the book of the covenant, Vayikra Ha'am, and he reads it in the ears of the people, Vayomru, and the people say, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Whatever God said, we will do, and we will, I'll translate it for the moment, understand. And I imagine there are many people here who are familiar with, this is a very famous expression, na'aseh v'nishma. This is where it appears. It never appears in chapter 19. It only appears here, and it appears here in the context of the covenant. Now, what is this book of the covenant? Nachmanides says the book of the covenant is essentially Moshe, the book that Moshe wrote, which is from the beginning of the book of Breshit until this point, which means essentially less than half of the Torah. This is the book of the covenant, which means everything of the Torah as we know it up to this point in time, this is now being recorded. And it's on this basis that the people are now entering into the covenant and committing themselves. Which means that in effect, the people are committing themselves to everything which has been mentioned in the Torah up to this point. And then what does it say in verse 8? Vayikach Moshe tadam, and then Moshe takes the blood, vayizrok al ha'am, and he sprinkles it on the people. And then we say vayomer. He says, Hinei dam habrit. This is the blood of the covenant, asher karat Hashem imachem, which God has made with you, al kol hadvarim ha'ele, regarding all these matters. Now, I just want to point out, I always had a problem with what does it mean that Moshe is sprinkling the blood on the people? I mean, how many people could he possibly be sprinkling the blood on? And you should just know Abarbanel had the same problem. So the Abarbanel says that actually Moshe didn't sprinkle the blood on the people. He said Moshe sprinkled the blood on those matzevot, on those monuments which each of the tribes had, which in a certain sense were representative of the people, which then would be actually very interesting, that half of the blood is on the Mizbeach, and according to the Abarbanel, the rest of the blood is then sprinkled on each of the 12 matzevot. And then what Moshe says is, this is the blood of the covenant, okay, which is now sealing the covenant between God and the Jewish people. So this is the ceremony. This is the covenant. Now, I want to just focus on a few elements. The first thing is that in this ceremony, there are two elements. One element is the book of the covenant, and then there's a second element, which are the sacrifices. The sacrifices which then are connected with the blood. And with regard to the book of the covenant, the people say, Na'aseh v'nishma. And with regard to the blood, it seems that the blood is sprinkled on the altar. It's also sprinkled on the people by splitting up in these two ways. It's as if by sprinkling it on the altar, you'll excuse the expression, it's as if I've sprinkled it on God, or the thing that represents God. And if you take the Abarbanel's interpretation, so then it's also very nice because of the parallel. If you're sprinkling it on the matzevot, you're sprinkling it on that which represents the people. So it's the idea that, in other words, we have now been committed to each other, locked in through blood. Now, I just want to point out, there are some very interesting parallels in this sense between what happens here, and for those of you who are familiar with the covenant between the parts in chapter 15 in the book of Bereshit, where God enters into a covenantal relationship with Abraham. And in that covenantal relationship, we have these animals that are split in two. And then there's a fire which walks between them. So this idea of somehow splitting things into two, which then actually becomes a way of binding two parties together. And what's also interesting is we have this idea of the blood, which also is connected with Abraham, because by Abraham, we have in chapter 17, the performance of Brit Milah. And even though it doesn't really speak about blood there, but we have maybe another place, which we're all familiar with, which is in chapter 12 in in Exodus. Chapter 12, which is the first Seder, which the Jewish people do, where they put the blood of the Paschal lamb on the doorposts. And on that basis, God passes over their houses. And in a certain sense, that blood also becomes the beginning of a process of a certain covenant between God and the Jewish people. It's also a covenant that's connected with sacrifices. So what am I trying to show you? What essentially I'm trying to show you is what's happening in this covenant over here is that what God did with Abraham is now being crystallized in maybe a parallel but different way with the Jewish people. And if Abraham, in a certain sense, becomes the first Jew in chapter 17, when he does Brit Milah, circumcision. And as I said, even though we don't mention blood there, but it would be reasonable to assume that there was an element of blood flowing in the circumcision, and how that idea is then begins to happen with the Jewish people, where the Jewish people begin to enter a covenantal relationship with God. And I mentioned this in one of my sessions, where the Jewish people begin to express their freedom even in the midst of slavery, when they offer the Korban Pesach and put the blood on the doorposts. So that is now coming to its final actualization in this covenant at Sinai. And this is when the Jewish people now actually become the Jewish people. And just so you understand the full meaning of that, and I have this on my source sheet for the people who want to actually see this. In the Mishnah Torah, in Maimonides' magnum opus, Code of Jewish Law, there's a section which is called Isurei Biyah, prohibited sexual relationships. And in chapter 13 of that section, that's where Maimonides begins a whole discussion of conversion. And the very first thing which Maimonides says when he starts talking about conversion is that with three things, the Jewish people entered the covenant: with Brit Milah, with Tvilah, which is ritual immersion, and with Korban, with a sacrifice. And Maimonides refers to our section, and in effect says that our section becomes the model for all generations for how one converts to Judaism. But I just want to say implicitly, if you're saying this is the model for all generations for conversion, what that in effect is saying is that what the Jewish people now is undergoing a conversion process, in the sense that they are now entering the covenant. They are becoming what we call Jews by choice. This is happening here. This is when we now are actually becoming the Jewish people. And one could say, but we were already the Jewish people. On one level, that's true. But I think it's important to realize Abraham became the first Jew when he did his circumcision. But this is where the Jewish people as a people become the Jewish people and need to become that people, where everyone is now entering the covenant. Unfortunately, I see, as always happens to me, my time is running out. So I want to just point out, why is it, I mentioned to you earlier, why is it so important from my perspective that the covenant is happening after the revelation at Sinai? And I'll just say that when I look at last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha, they reflect two different elements of Judaism, which are complementary and which are necessary And maybe, as I said, maybe my bias is more to this week's Parsha. And what is that? What do I mean by that? As I mentioned in last week's Parsha, the thrust is the revelation, the I-thou encounter. And that's one aspect of Judaism, which we could perhaps refer to as having a deep, meaningful, religious experience. And that's what we seek, to be able to have those profound experiences, those I-thou encounters. And if I had to give you a parallel, which I referred to earlier, it's also very similar to what happened at the Red Sea, which was also a very profound religious experience. And one could say that what connects the Red Sea with the revelation at Sinai, which I actually did say before, is the idea of a profound experience which then deepens my faith, which crystallizes my faith. Okay, to put it in different language, where God all of a sudden becomes real. God is there, it's in my face, even to the point where I'm trembling because it's so real, it's so tangible. And that's extremely important. And what I would even say is that's something which we, in a certain sense, aspire to. But unfortunately, those experiences may be few and far between. What ultimately sustains us are the little things, the day-to-day things. To what extent is it that I not only experience God at Sinai with the thunder and the lightning, but do I experience God in mundane laws of interaction with people? In terms of, issues of torts, in terms of how do I watch other people's property? How careful am I to not hurt people by the things that I say? And therefore, it's important to be able to complement those deep experiences with also something which is ongoing, which is also something which I'm committed to, where I'm committed to somehow play these things out in the minutiae of day-to-day living. And that's our Parsha. That's much more challenging. But that's something which ultimately is much more sustaining. Right? And since there are many people I see out there, right? And I hope I don't say anything which is going to press people's buttons. It's like getting married. You get married, you fall in love, right? And okay, in the best of situations, right? Right, when you're young or maybe not so young, right? You all of a sudden have stars and you hear bells and everything's excited. And, and then all of a sudden you get married and you have to wash dishes. And then you might have to change diapers. And you may have to clean laundry. Well, do I still love you? Do I still care about you? In other words, like, where is all the, the sparkle and the glamour? And, do I want to keep this going? And that's why, from a Jewish perspective, a relationship is not one which is just based on glamour and glitter and always having, wow experiences. But it's something which has to be grounded in commitment. And commitment to the most basic day-to-day things, the little things in life. And I want to end with one last point, something to think about. You know, we always talk about the idea of na'aseh v'nishma, right? The Jewish people, and they said, here we are. We're going to now do, and we will understand. Okay? And wow, that sounds really great. You know, in other words, and usually the way people take this is, you know, I'm prepared to now commit myself, even though I don't necessarily understand it. Okay? But first I'm going to do it, right? I'm not going to ask questions, and then I'll understand it. And I know that there are a lot of people who are not particularly big fans about this type of attitude, you know, like, you know, just doing things without understanding them. But I want to now give it a slightly different twist. But how many people actually make the effort to then understand and to really try to pursue things and to really try to find the meaning in things? You know, it's one thing to say that I don't want to just do things blindly, but I want to be able to, you know, understand it. But how much do people make the effort to really try to understand it? And how much do people realize that the more that you try to understand, the more that you do understand, then maybe the more meaningful things actually do become. And maybe that's a lesson with respect to what I was saying about the little things in life. That very often people tend to brush off the little things in life. So big deal, like, you know, who needs to do that and who needs to do that? And, you know, what really matters are the biggies, so to speak. But maybe that's actually a misperception. Maybe people, if they were to actually understand more the little things, would realize how much little things actually are really huge and big. And that maybe you can't necessarily make such a simple division between the really important things and the things that, you know, big deal. So what I would say is, for me, this is why it becomes so important that the covenant had to come after the revelation. As a way of saying, yes, revelation is important, but now let's roll up our sleeves and get down to the nitty-gritty. And now commit ourselves and realize that it's not always going to be glitter and glamour. And it's not always going to be a wow experience. And there are going to be all kinds of things which maybe we just grit our teeth and we do, but we do because we're committed. But maybe if we're really committed, and if it really matters to us, then maybe we'll also make an effort, nishma, to understand. And maybe the more that we make the effort to understand, the more we can actually find, as I said, the meaning and the value in all those little things. Shabbat shalom, everyone.